Welcome back to the 1-0 podcast brought to you by Penn State Student Affairs. I'm Seth Engle.
And I'm Zach Allen.
And we have some breaking news to discuss today. The Big Ten conference schedules from 2024 through 2028 were released on Thursday. We're going to break that all down. We'll talk about, whether Penn State may have the toughest Big Ten schedule, at least for 2024. We'll break down some of the others as well there. We'll talk about what it will take to potentially make a college football playoff, with the playoff expanding to 12 teams next year. And we'll give a little early win projection. Obviously there are a lot of changes that could come with the transfer portal and recruiting. But as of right now, we'll break that all down for you. So let's start off with this. We've seen, what Penn State kind of has on its slate next year. It looks tough. So it's USC, Ohio State, UCLA, and Washington. Penn State's going to play all those teams next year. It's a pretty difficult schedule, especially compared to what we've seen the past couple of years. How do you think that schedule kind of stacks up against the rest of the Big Ten? And is it potentially the toughest schedule in the Big Ten next year?
It potentially could be. I think it's definitely in the top 5. I don't know if it's number 1, but compared to Penn State big conference schedules of the years past, obviously it's much harder. They didn't just grab, a Stanford from the Pac-12 or Arizona. They grabbed 3 of the top 4 ranked teams from this year, plus UCLA, who's no slouch either. I think they're really up there. You have USC on the road, I think, is potentially the most difficult game. But then you have Ohio State, always a tough game, even though it's at home, Washington at home, and UCLA at home. There is no Michigan. That's, probably a saving grace. They don't have, 5 incredible teams. But then you throw in, a road game against Wisconsin in a tough Wisconsin atmosphere. There's not really a slouch. I mean, I guess Illinois is probably the worst team on the schedule, or Minnesota, but Minnesota's on the road. But there's not really an Indiana or a Northwestern or Rutgers. So I think for that reason alone, just the lack of a weak team, I think they're definitely up there for sure.
Yeah, I think that's what kind of separates the schedule that we've seen over the past, over 10 years with the Big Ten divisions has kind of been, there are the games that you're supposed to win, and then there are the games that you have to win to be able to make a postseason run, which Penn State really has not been able to do consistently. So, what we've kind of seen, at least for the first 5 games this year where they're not playing, an Ohio State or Michigan yet, those are all the games where, okay, it's expected. Northwestern, it's expected. West Virginia, even this year, was expected. Delaware, obviously expected. They beat all those teams pretty handily. Next year, and we'll see how the actual schedule pans out with dates, there really aren't a bunch of gimmies. There are some gimmies in Illinois and Maryland and Minnesota and Purdue, and even Wisconsin are games that Penn State, will be favored in and are expected to win. But those are relatively competitive teams that have done pretty well, for the most part in the Big Ten West, at least over the past few years. Now, I think when you kind of look around the conference, you can kind of look at non-conference schedules too. And I think Michigan next year with playing Texas is a really difficult matchup to kind of stick right in on your schedule. What do you see from their schedule? I think it's personally between Penn State and Michigan for toughest schedules in the conference next year. What do you see from Michigan and how does that kind of stack up to Penn State's?
Yeah, Michigan does have the advantage in that they play Indiana and Northwestern, at least in the conference schedule. But, they also play the top 3 Pac-12 teams that are coming over here. They're playing Oregon, Washington, and USC. Washington's the only one on the road, and they also have Ohio State on the road. And you mentioned Texas, but they opened the season against Fresno State, who's, Michigan's going to be favored to win that game, but Fresno State's ranked right now. Like that's not, we saw, like, it's one of those games that, you open the season with, you could see some growing pains. And then the second week, again, you go into Texas. And I think it's a non-conference that really sets Michigan's maybe a little above par with Penn State's. But, Penn State also has a road game against West Virginia, which I think adds to their non-conference schedule. So I think those two teams probably are two of the hardest schedules in the entire country for 2024, just because of their non-conference schedules.
Yeah, I mean, you look around the conference, and I don't know. I mean, the non-conference thing is true. I think that's an added kind of challenge on your schedule when Michigan, Texas. I mean, the Michigan AD's got to be shaking his head right now. At scheduling that, when they did, and I don't know. That's not doing them any favors that the Big Ten, has added 4 Pac-12 teams since then. So that'll be a big challenge, and these TV networks are just grinning from cheekbone to cheekbone right now, looking at this schedule when it's like, okay, this is why it happened. This is why conference expansion is a thing, is because these are all the marquee games that people want to see. Gone are the days of having a Penn State Rutgers noon game every year. Like, now instead of that, it's going to be like, okay, we'll put in an Oregon game and a Washington, a game that, has the potential to be like a playoff atmosphere and a playoff outcome, but it's actually still in the regular season. So it's really exciting for sure. Let's get into college football playoff talk and what it could mean or what it would take for Penn State to reach that. But first, a quick word for our sponsor.
Expand your horizons and explore off-campus adventures with Student Affairs. Alternative Breaks gives you the chance to see something new, contribute to a community, or build a stronger relationship with yourself or others. Fall and spring break options are open to any student interested in experiencing something new. Explore nature and push your limits with an outdoor adventure trip with Campus Recreation. Guided trips allow you to explore something new in nature, push your boundaries, and discover the world. Trips for backpacking, fly fishing, climbing, scuba diving, mountaineering, and more are waiting for you. Sign up today with Campus Recreation to get outside. Follow @StudentLifePSU to get updates on upcoming break trips.
So with a 12-team playoff on the horizon, and we're kind of seeing how this Big Ten landscape, could potentially shape up next year, what exactly will it take for Penn State to reach a playoff next year?
Yeah, I was going to say if it was another 4-team playoff, it would be extremely tough. I don't think, any of these Big Ten teams are probably going to go undefeated because the schedules are just so hard now. But the fact that there's 12 teams, the 6 conference winners get in and the next 6 highest, I think that bodes well for Penn State and kind of gives them leniency for maybe sneaking in with 2 losses. Obviously, strength of schedule is, a focus point for the college football playoff committee when they select the teams that are going to be in. But in the past, you have 2 losses and there's just no chance really that you're going to be getting in the playoff. But now you could see Penn State, losing to USC on the road and then Ohio State at home, but they beat UCLA and Washington, Wisconsin, and then they might sneak in that 12 spot, 11 spot. Again, you don't really want to test that, but I think overall even though there are more teams being allowed in the playoff, I still think it's going to be harder or just as hard as getting in with the 4 team, because right now the Big Ten has 6 top 10 teams that are in the top 25 right now. And that alone, only one of them is going to get the auto bid from being the conference champion. So then the next 5 would fill up 5 of the next 6 spots. But if you're not one of those 5, then you're kind of screwed. And then you add in the SEC teams. So I think it's a lot harder. They really have to, lock in and kind of have 2 loss maximum, which, they've done in the past with only Ohio State and Michigan, but now they have more teams to worry about.
I feel like there's even room to potentially lose 3 games and still make it,
Oh,
depending on your non-conference schedule. Like Michigan next year, if they lose 3 games, but they also have a good Texas team on their schedule and the conference schedule they have now, and Fresno State, like I think there's definitely room to consider a 3-loss team in there, and Penn State maybe too if West Virginia is able to turn this recent success into something consistent. It's a lot of changes right now, and I think it's kind of hard to say with what's going to happen next year in a 12-team playoff. We don't really know what anything's going to look like. SEC is going to look different too. Their schedules are going to be tough. They're obviously not adding as many, I guess high-profile teams as maybe the Big Ten is. But that's going to be a hard conference next year when you add, Oklahoma and Texas to the mix there. The ACC's interesting where, maybe they have a couple teams that are competitive top heavy. It'll just be weird to balance when, you have a team in the ACC that maybe is going undefeated or close to undefeated, and you're trying to balance that with a Big Ten team with a ridiculously hard schedule that maybe lost 2 or 3 games. Like what would you do then if you're the committee?
I honestly don't know. And then you have the whole Pac-12 thing where it's just right now it's just Oregon State and Washington State. So that's a whole different thing. But yeah, I think with the ACC, I don't know, because it's just really hard to say. Like the college football landscape is totally changing right now, and if Florida State or Clemson were to go 12-0, does it really look better than, a Michigan team or USC team or a Penn State team that's 11-1 but played 5 top 10 teams? You can make the case that it's more impressive to go 11-1 while facing 5 top 10, top 15 teams, while Florida State's playing, Clemson. Duke's had a good year. Who knows if they can keep that up? But just, overall a much weaker conference. But so I honestly don't know. I think if an ACC team does have 2 losses, though, that I still think they're kind of out of the playoff automatically. But who knows? Like, it's just, we're going to have to see next season. There's no way to definitely answer that now.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the committee is going to, show a little more love to the SEC and the Big Ten than the ACC. Penn State, let's talk about the actual, the team here. Because next year, I think, was kind of seen as the year, if it's not this season, next fall is kind of the one where things come together, right? Yeah. Like Drew Aller, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, Abdul Carter, all these guys are going to be juniors at that point. Final year before they can head to the draft. Seasoned vets. It looked like a year in a 12-team playoff format that things would really come together. Where does that stand now? Like, how good could Penn State actually be next year when they're facing, some of the toughest teams in the country?
Yeah, I mean, Drew Aller is going to be a junior, same with Nick Singleton, all those guys. But then on the flip side, you got to think Olu's probably going to the draft. Kalen King's probably going to the draft. A lot of the O-line, Hunter Norzad, Sal Wormley, Caden Wallace, on top of Olu, are running out of eligibility. Same with the secondary. Johnny Dixon and Daquan Hardy are also running out of eligibility. And then even coaching-wise, we didn't know this season if Manny Diaz was still going to be here. He's a head coach, caliber coach, just being a defensive coordinator for Penn State right now. It could very well be by the time next season starts, he has a head coaching job somewhere. So it's kind of a mix of both things. I think Drew Aller's getting great experience right now, being the head signal caller before, he has a significant uptick in strength of schedule, as well as the wide receivers. They've kind of been trying to find their identity, kind of get in sync with Drew. But yeah, it's going to be interesting again because when the whole offensive line pretty much runs out of eligibility. Granted, you have J.B. Nelson, Drew Shelton still there. It's it's going to be tough. So yeah, I think next year could be the year, but they're still going to lose, a lot of playmakers that they've kind of stood tall on this year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm alone in this ideology, but I would be surprised if Manny Diaz is back next year.
Yeah.
Like, I think he's done enough. I think he did enough last year to show that he should be a head coach and, at the Power 5 level once again. And this year, obviously, the defense has just been spectacular, firing on all cylinders. But I think to your point, like, there could be a big shakeup next year, despite the fact that, a lot of these big playmakers like Aller and the running backs are returning. Now, I do think, a big talking point this year has been about the depth that Penn State has. And next year it'll be about that depth continuing, but those depth pieces that we're seeing this year bumping up into starter roles and leadership roles. But I do think, you bring up an interesting question here, and is that, does Penn State have a better chance to reach a 4-team playoff this year than it does to reach a 12-team next year?
This might be a hot take. I feel like they do. I mean, the defense has been incredible this year. And that's partly because of Manny Diaz's scheme and coaching. And, the secondary, again, Penn State's giving up the least amount of yards in the entire FBS. And then offensively, Drew Aller's the only Big Ten QB that hasn't thrown an interception. And, you still have the easier schedule right now. Obviously, they still have to play Ohio State and Michigan, but you still have Indiana, Maryland, Rutgers, Michigan State, who's been struggling this year. And you have that O-line that's very experienced offensive line. And, you can have all these playmakers like Nick Singleton, Drew Aller, Katron, but with no one to block, like, what are they really going to do? Then that's not to say that Penn State doesn't have quality offensive linemen on the second string, but, Olu's could be the first offensive lineman taken in the draft. And so when you talk about next year, having USC, Ohio State, Washington, UCLA, while they don't have Michigan, that's a very, very tough schedule just in the Big Ten. And then, there's a lot of good SEC teams out there, the ACC. The ACC is going to be like those group of 5 teams, I think. That's just going to be like, they have a weaker schedule. Back to the original point, I think it might be a little easier to sneak into the top 4 than it might be to sneak into the top 12 next year.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes down to a race for one loss or fewer in a season, I think the road this year does appear easier than it does next year when you kind of pack your schedule with all those teams. But, I mean, it's just food for thought.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens next year with how a 12-team playoff plays out. Things will change. If Penn State is able to go to a playoff this year, that will then impact how teams view them in the transfer portal, how recruits view them as well. So that could all play an impact in whether they fill those holes, like you're talking about with the offensive line and some of those other playmakers departing. But, I mean, that's about it for us. This has been the 1-0 Pod. You can follow us at psucollegian.com online and at Twitter at PSU Footblog.